Two chapters from the Companionate Marriage, 1927. Chapter 3 Marriage and Morals. I stopped not long ago at a hotel in an important Midwestern city where another Denver man, whom I will call Ewing, since that was not his name, was also staying. I knew him well, and rather early in the morning I dropped in at his room. For a time we chatted of this and that. Presently I went to the window to take in the fine view that it commanded. Near that window was a dresser, and on the dresser was the usual early morning litter, a collar, a comb, a razor, and other items that would normally be there together with others that would normally be quite somewhere else than on the dresser of a man 1,000 miles from wife and home. Several hairpins, for instance, of the sort used for controlling bobbed hair, and a long-toothed comb in which a few golden strands were visible, shining like gold threads there in the morning sun. I looked away as quickly as I could, but our eyes met and he grinned sheepishly. "I own up, Judge," he said. "I know you won't peach or preach." You can be at ease on that score, Ewing," I said. "But what's the trouble? I would have said that among all the married couples I know you and your wife would be about the last to have such a thing happen as this. I have always thought of your marriage as showing that marriage isn't, after all, a failure, other evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. And here you pull this on me." My eyes turned again to the dresser. I was further from it now, but even at that distance one could see that gleam of hair, leaky 43-44 spun gold. His eyes followed mine and for a moment we looked in thoughtful silence. "You see it's beautiful," he said at last, defensively. "A blind man could see that," said I. "But what I'd like to know is how long it will take, at this rate, before you and your wife and two fine children, who have equities in the integrity of their home, appear in my court with business to transact." "We'd be there right away if my wife ever found ye's out," he admitted. Then he added with a groan, "Oh, Lord, what a mess. I love and worship her, but would she believe it if she knew about this? Never." "There is a line in the marriage service of the Church of England," I observed, "that has been partly expurgated from the marriage service of the Book of Common Prayer in this country. In substance, if my memory serves me, it runs, 'With this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship and with all my worldly goods I thee endow.' A fine, specific use of language, don't you think? I once heard a high-bred American woman say of it that she thought it indecent, but if marriage is to mean that, then we ought to be specific about it in our own minds, should we not? And if it is to mean something different, to correspond to the changes in this different age, then we ought to be specific about that also." "True enough," he said gloomily. "But it's darned hard to switch from one angle to the other. It's been a wrench for me, and it would be impossible for my wife. And yet I think I'm right. I do worship her with all of me. But in love you deal with infinity. I rob her of nothing when I go with this girl. And as for all my worldly goods, why, she has everything in the way of material comfort and provision that money can buy, and I have not violated the spirit of the agreement there, unless the dog in the manger philosophy enters in. Of course I have violated the letter of the agreement. I admit that. But the letter killeth, while the spirit giveth life. I repeat, I rob her of nothing. Do you love the girl?" "I love my wife," he answered. "As for the girl, why that depends on what you call love. I like her, and if she had more mental capacity I might come nearer to loving her. But even I want all of you 45 then she would not usurp the place held by my wife because one reacts toward individuals individually and uniquely. There is no duplicating in one woman the love one feels toward another woman. That is why this talk about exclusiveness in love seems to me a lie, a jealous lie. No, I don't love this girl in any deep or vital sense. We could part tomorrow and never see each other again and we would feel no more regret than one feels ordinarily when separated from persons one is fond of. I simply like her. I have an affection for her. I enjoy her company. She attracts me. I enjoy taking her out to dinner and to see a show. That's innocent enough, isn't it? Well, I have enjoyed being completely en rapport with her, and for the same reason. The dinner and the show by themselves were not complete, and this other made it all complete and lovely. For the life of me I can't find any rational reason against it. We gave each other pleasure. We took what heaven gave and we found it good, but society would step in and defile this beautiful thing by calling it unclean. Damn it, Judge, I won't stand for it. She and I have enriched each other's lives. I am more of a man than I was, and she is more of a woman than she was, because of it. People enrich each other by knowing each other, don't they? When you really know people, you know their mannerisms, their gestures, their way of thought, their emotional responses, the color of their hair, the lights in their eyes. One knows these things emotionally and by experiencing them. But they can't be experienced completely without sex. They can't be grasped merely by the mind. And if society requires of such understandings between men and women that they must stop short of physical sex expression, then that nips in the bud what, in many instances, should be permitted to grow. No exchange short of the complete exchange, no merely mental exchange, can suffice. If your wife heard you, I remarked, she would say that such remarks, if they applied to her, would be the philosophy of the ideal husband. They would apply to her if she'd let them, he said, beginning to pace the room furiously. But she'd say, I want all of you, 46 physically and spiritually, and if there is more of you left over after I am completely sufficed, then I want that, too. No other woman must have it. I have enough, but if I can't use the surplus, no one else shall. She would deny the existence of the surplus, I said. She would say that you were dissipating your energies and that it is the essence of love that it is exclusive. Quantitative thinking, he retorted, as if one measured love in a bushel. Erotic avarice. I've done no wrong, I tell you. I have a right to think for myself and I'm going to do it. I guess I know what goes on inside of me. You are a rare one if you do, I observed. Does all this upset you inside, pull you to pieces, so to speak? I ask because I have a belief that your subjective mind plays hob with you when you violate the habits and fears it was bred to. He laughed. Does it? Why, at first it made a wreck of me. I was nervous as a cat and I felt like a criminal. It was as if I had committed murder or burgled a house. But I'm getting over that, and I'd be over it completely if my wife knew and approved what I'm doing. Gee, if I could only tell her. I take no sides in these matters, I said. And my questions are less intended to express disapproval than they are to draw you out. I'd be interested to know how this situation came about. He lit a cigarette and sat down. It will be a relief to open up. Here's the way I see it honestly, Judge. Margaret and I had reached a humdrum condition of life. Sex was humdrum. I didn't realize this, but she did, and she resented it, as a woman will, because she interpreted it to mean that I didn't care for her as I once did. She didn't realize that it was merely human, and that daily habit may deaden sensibility. Or, if she did realize it, she resented it and felt that where she was concerned such a thing should not happen. She figured that the glow of our courting days had passed, and that we had settled down to an arrangement from which all romance and beauty had fled. And she said so, and of course that created the very lack of romance and beauty of which she complained. My vehement denials did no good. She didn't believe me. Like a gadfly 47, the net result was a strained atmosphere in our home, with periodic outbreaks of exasperation from her, which storm I weathered as best I could. You can't force love, you know, and you can't force the active manifestations of sex. The more pressure she applied, the deader I went inside. Fear, anxiety, the sense of strain and the consciousness that I was in a false position, all conspired to inhibit me. She, being, as you know, an exceptionally intelligent person, realized all this with her mind, but that didn't serve to control the instinctive something within her that impelled her to sting like a gadfly when her resentment came to the surface. Then, of course, she began, without meaning to look for causes of offense. It was a defensive measure, I suppose, as it tended to justify her in her own eyes. And when one looks for causes of offense in this life, one finds plenty. Little faults in me that had formerly had her indulgence became enormously significant. Mostly they were fresh evidence that I had ceased to love her as a normal woman wants to be loved, wanted, and courted. I could see how she felt, but the element of compulsion which she had introduced into the situation without meaning to, had put me under an evil spell. We had violent quarrels, during which she would nearly drive me to frenzy, nagging and prodding me with her tongue. And then, under that abnormal tension, the quarrel would dissolve in tears, and for a time after that we would seem to understand each other and would be happy in each other again. I have come to the conclusion, Judge, that when a woman lashes out at a man with her tongue the way she did at me, she is obeying a very profound biological impulse and a very effective one, for those hours of misery did seem to have the effect of bringing us together. The trouble was it didn't last. Usually within a week we'd have it all to do over again. At last she began to wonder if there wasn't some other woman in my life, who was taking from her the love I would otherwise have given her. I don't know how long she had been wondering about this, but now she openly speculated about it. I want particularly to call your attention to the fact that up 48 to that time there was no other woman, and that I had never contemplated such a thing, save perhaps as every married man is at times tempted by women he meets casually and fancies he might like to know them better, thoughts he is careful to hide from his wife. At least I hid them from mine. She wouldn't understand it in a million years. He paused in bitter silence. Don't be an ass, Ewing, I said. You ought to know better than to underestimate her intelligence like that. That's a much bigger insult to her than any liaison could be. The trouble is you've never had the nerve to tell her the truth. It's a pity she can't hear this conversation. In fact, it's a pity a lot of wives can't overhear it. They might learn something. Take your nerve in hand and tell her the truth. She's a wonderful woman, she has a fine mind and a big heart. She'd get it. He raised his hands despairingly. Sure, she's wonderful. Mentally she's a whiz. Sometimes she makes me feel like 10 cents in comparison. But damn it, Judge, she's a woman. Moreover, her whole background and training have blinded her to just this kind of thing, though they have opened her eyes to a lot of other things. What goes on inside of me is simply outside of her ken. I'm sure of it. If she could read my mind she'd be shocked beyond anything she could put in words. And besides, this is a one-sided business. I'd have to do all the confessing. She hasn't got anything to confess. Hell's bells. Why, she's like Caesar's wife, she's a sort of an unapproachable Diana. She's as chaste as Lucerus. And if I owned up, she'd be judge and jury in one. How can I possibly meet a prospect like that? Perhaps she isn't so oppressively good as you think, I said. At least let's hope not. I'll wager she's human and you ought to know it for sure. Anyhow, go ahead with your story. He resumed, she put the idea of other women into my head. She suggested it by her accusations and I suddenly found myself getting a kick out of it. I think a lot of women do this and virtually drive their husbands to it. And some husbands. I queried. Do they drive their wives to it? A reverse English unhappiness 49, I suppose so. But I never thought of such a thing in connection with her. FVE never seen the least evidence that other men attract her. I have no doubt, however, I could put the idea into her head all right by saying to her things such as she has said to me. It might teach her a lesson. At any rate, the notion grew in my mind. I had an instinctive feeling that it might be the way out. So I took up with this girl, a nice little girl, Judge. She used to work in my office. And here, far from home, we can be together without anxiety or fear. Now, Judge, I come to the heart of the matter. You can believe it or not, but a very curious thing happened when I made that break. It was, of course, a fresh and unusual experience, and one grows by fresh and unusual experiences. They renew one's ability to find interesting meanings in life. This experience, after the first shock of fear and doubt and what I may call remorse, was over, seemed to rehabilitate me. It stirred me up inside. Above all, it took sex out of the routine and humdrum it had fallen into and gave it back the meaning and the compelling charm it had for me formerly. In fact, it gave my love life such a fillip that it transformed things at home. It all carried over into my relations with my wife, as if I had come back to her with the honeymoon point of view of which time and habit had robbed me. My wife is now happy. She has remarked repeatedly on the change in me. Naturally, I have ventured no explanations. I am rather surprised that she hasn't asked more questions. But she is apparently perfectly happy, and she seems to have gotten over the notion that I have transferred my affections from her to someone else. If she has any secret theory about it, I imagine it is to the effect that I may have had another woman on the string, but that I have now abandoned my wild ways, have dropped the other woman or women and have come back to her. Which is exactly opposite to the facts. Think of the irony of it, Judge. What would she say if she knew to what she owes her present happiness? 5. And so you are satisfied? Satisfied? I'll say not. Look at the fix I'm in. Here 50 I've got to lie and go on lying for the rest of my life. I have to make a business of concealment, and in our most intimate moments I have this secret to hide, when it would be perfect if I could tell her. Even at that she is likely sometime to stumble on the truth. And then her humiliation and her hurt pride and her feeling that she was not able to hold me not attractive enough to compete with other women and with youth, all that, can't you imagine what would happen? Why, she'd diagnose me and herself and the situation dead wrong. So fear dogs my steps. The satisfaction and benefit I might derive from this liaison, though it is not destroyed, is nevertheless reduced from what it might be. The whole-souled and carefree pleasure I ought to feel has to be restrained and watchful. I carry a sort of weight in my heart. I can't reason this away. Subjective habit, as you say. As far back as I can remember, I have been taught that what I am now doing is wrong, a heinous sin. I don't believe that, and yet I am haunted by a feeling of internal anxiety from which I think nothing could wholly relieve me except my wife's understanding and approval. And I know that is a large order to place with any human, flesh and blood woman educated to the traditional code of society in these matters. What do you think of it? I can't say that I see anything unusual in your case, I answered, unless it's your desire to confide in your wife. As for the subjective conflict within you, I have seen many instances of that. Of course, this talk about a man being able to love two women at the same time is old stuff. They all say that. Many men say it can be done and most women say it can't. Perhaps it is a matter of individual temperament. I didn't say I loved two women at once, he retorted. I think you are trying to draw me out. I don't love this girl in any deep sense of the word. I like her. She's a pleasant companion, she's pretty as a picture and desirable as a gift from heaven. It is pleasant and lovely to be with her. Why demand that our play together take on the seriousness and weight of a lifetime passion? We neither of us want that. So, what's the harm, Judge? Mrs. Ewing suspects 51. Is she of age? I asked. He laughed. She is. You have no call to show your judicial teeth. Besides, this is a private and personal matter, as I see it, between her and me. It concerns nobody else, neither our neighbors nor the law. I interfere in people's lives as little as I can, I replied. And you need fear nothing of the sort from me. As to having it out with your wife, of course you know her better than I do, and I don't presume to advise you on that point. In general, however, I think truth is a fine thing if you can get people to understand it. Most of us, unfortunately, regard facts as very offensive things. You'll have to use your own judgment. But don't underestimate your wife's intelligence and good sense. If you do underestimate it, that may account for part of the trouble you have had. Try telling her. And if she forbids this affair to go on? Be a sport, I said. Take a chance on her. Maybe you and she can build a practicable scheme of living out of the wreck. Now that would be interesting, wouldn't it? But he shook his head. A foolish risk, he said. The situation is too one-sided. I've done all the sinning. Still, almost thou persuadest me almost. 2. Though the conversation ended there, the incident did not. Months later I chanced to meet Mrs. Ewing. Her hair was black, not golden, but it had a fine sheen of health and beauty. She had keen brown eyes, a fine forehead, a firm, sweet mouth, and a width of jaw that indicated vitality and energy. Mrs. Ewing is a graduate of a world-known women's college in the East. Among the many splendid women I have met, she stands out as possessing what I consider a distinguished intellect. I shall long remember my talk with her as one of the most remarkable experiences I have ever had among the many that have come my way. I have had conversations with distinguished men, many of them leaders in the thought of this nation, and some of these have expressed with skill and with fine logic ideas which I have 52 found stimulating and suggestive. But what I am about to recount came from a quiet, high-bred Denver woman. I shall set it down as faithfully as my memory of the occasion will permit. Let me explain in this connection that the conversations I recount in this book are necessarily reduced to their significant essentials. It would be impossible, in a reasonable space, to recount the details of talks which in their accomplishment often occupied hours of time and repeated interviews. Digging the truth out of people is sometimes a slow business, and I want the reader to understand that these stories as I tell them usually develop far more swiftly in these pages than did the actual events on which they are based. Such foreshortening of the picture is proper and necessary, but I want the reader to understand it. The talk between Mrs. Ewing and myself turned at first on some phases of my work in which she was interested, and it drifted toward the subject of marriage, as I meet with it in my domestic relations work. I let it drift because I was curious to find out, if I could, what would be this woman's response if her husband should take his courage in his hands and tell her the truth, as I am satisfied all husbands and all wives should do if they are both of them intelligent enough to line up facts and evaluate them. Not all persons are so qualified, but it seemed to me that the Ewings were. People who are sufficiently intelligent to understand the truth are entitled to know it. But the truth may wreck others who lack the intelligence to cope with it. I cited to Mrs. Ewing a typical case of marital infidelity, sufficiently like that of her own husband to serve as a test of her way of thought in such matters. She heard me through in silence. Should he tell her? I concluded. Suppose you were the woman. Would you get his point of view? If I were the woman, she said slowly, I think I would understand and that I might put up with the situation though I would not like it. But would that be understanding? I asked. Wouldn't such a grudging concession merely be a source of fresh trouble? Could Intuitions 53 he be happy in his liaison? Wouldn't he have to drop it, and wouldn't the second state be worse than the first? She shook her head. I see that. But it's a lot to ask, a lot to expect. Might such a woman not feel, I continued, that her husband's faith in her understanding and sympathy was rather a compliment and pretty conclusive evidence that he valued his relations with her so highly that he was willing to take tremendous chances with them in order to have them on a sound basis of mutual understanding? The question rather strikes home, she said. You see, Judge, she paused, faltered, and then went on, I have reason to think that Henry is indulging in just such an affair as you have described. He doesn't dream, I suspect it. Perhaps on the whole it is better that he doesn't tell me. I might not be able to weather it. That is why I have not been able to bring myself to investigating and finding out. I lack the courage, I guess. Still, I suggested, you would feel that the truth, if he produced it, would be in a sense a tribute to you. You'd respect him if he told it? She nodded. I think I am hoping, in the back of my mind, that he will. In the meantime, I only suspect this affair, and I am not letting it come between us. We have been quite happy lately. Why do you suspect it? She shrugged. Intuition, I guess. Little indications. And well, he seems to care more for me, for one thing. I held my breath, afraid even to look up for fear my face might betray me. Manifestly one never can tell about a woman. It sometimes makes me feel, she went on, that if he knew that I knew about it and that if I could convince myself and him that I grudged him and the possible other woman no pleasure they might take in each other, then he would love me beyond measure, he would care for me beyond anything he could express, far more than he could care for any other woman, no matter how intimate a friendship he might have with her. Do you see what I mean, Judge? Does it sound shocking? I fear I put it clumsily, for I'm groping in the dark, and I don't know quite what I mean myself. All I know is that I have these 54 ideas at times, and that I'm torn by this conflict between my reason and my emotions / the emotions natural to any woman when some other woman intrudes. I think what I mean is this, that love is never delivered on demand, and that the true way to get it is to claim nothing and demand nothing, and simply to welcome it as a gift, arbitrarily bestowed by the giver. After all, sex as sex is a more or less meaningless and worthless thing. What gives it meaning and emotional value is the love back of it, and love is by no means synonymous with sex, though we often use the word as if it were. And so I think sometimes that if I could make him love me first of all, not as a woman but as a human being, because he found me truly sweet and lovable, then his desire for me would follow, and if his desire were conceived in that fashion, it would be a truly wonderful, constant, and permanent thing, would it not? And of course it works both ways. I naturally love him primarily for what he is as a person, and my desire for him as a man must spring from that and be conditioned by that, if it is to be real and spiritually fruitful. One thing that has made me think this might be so is that even the release I suspect him of having taken for himself seems to have made him care more for me. I think he feels that I no longer restrict him and deprive him of something his nature may crave, not just sex, you know, but human intimacies. Things are better between us now than they have been in years. Sometimes he is just one great big desire for me, like the eager boy he was when I married him. And I can't tell you how I love to have him so. If this can happen as a result of his summarily and secretly taking his freedom, how much greater would be the result if he had not had to take it? Suppose we both gave, without stint. I have heard you say, Judge, that marriage should ideally mean the union of one man and one woman. Is that your conception of marriage? Emphatically, I said. She nodded. I think that is right. That is the way marriage should be. But it begins to come to me, Judge, that Henry and I have not been attaining a genuinely monogamic marriage by the unique communion 55 ways we were taught, the ways of enforced and jealous exclusiveness. I begin to think that these outsiders who may enter into his life, or who might, I suppose, enter into mine, don't necessarily enter into our marriage, or become a factor within it, or in any way disrupt it or share it with us, or otherwise come between us. Love remains in that sense truly exclusive, a thing which we two possess between us, a unique communion in which no third person could share. I begin to think that the only way outsiders could rob us of this would be for one or both of us to forbid them to come in. If one does that, they may break in, like thieves, and rob us of each other. I don't know whether there is any soundness in these notions, but they may interest you because they are what I am thinking about, and I know you are tolerant toward people and their thoughts. I'm tolerant toward them so long as they try to think, said I. And I try even to be tolerant toward those who don't. I am at least trying, she smiled. But though it all sounds very plausible and convincing, Judge, theories and feelings are two different things. I theorize bravely, but I don't know how far I dare trust myself in doing. It is what one does that counts, not how one speculates and philosophizes. But the doing is dangerous. I feel as if I were on the edge of a precipice with my eyes blindfolded. You won't get very far with all this, Mrs. Ewing, I answered, so long as you and your husband conceal your thoughts from each other. he probably wishes he might talk honestly with you, just as you would like to talk honestly with him if you could get over your fear of each other and particularly if he could get rid of his fear of you. Men commonly believe that women can't possibly get the masculine point of view in these matters. But I think that is nonsense. You have just demonstrated it. Let me make one suggestion. Sometime draw your husband into a general conversation about these matters and express some of the views you have been putting to me. Do it in a wholly impersonal fashion. Can a woman talk impersonally? She asked. 56 Certainly, if they see the desirability of it, I replied. The trouble is that they generally don't. Let me make another suggestion. Between intelligent persons who owe each other the truth and are capable of making facts definitive, concealment is the worst form of infidelity I know of, and both you and your husband seem to have been guilty of that. Society puts no stigma on such infidelity, but it is none the less deadly. It shuns the truth because it distrusts it and thinks it may be a lie. This attitude is due to fear, and fear is death. Remember, too, that since jealousy is fear, jealousy, too, is death. Now, one other thing. Would you have anything to confide in him? She laughed. I see the point, Judge. I almost wish I had. It would put us on a level. I suppose it wouldn't do for me to fabricate a sin. It's the solemn truth that I was once tempted. I felt the impulse. I don't think Henry could imagine me being even that wicked. That's one trouble. A woman should never allow herself to seem too dependable in such matters. Certainties are so uninteresting. 3 I think, I replied, that both of you may be rather missing the point. Let's G0LJLEs clear. Does this philosophy of yours mean that you would, isard or discount monogamy? I don't think it does, she answered, though perhaps it sounds carrot for some might interpret it that way, I commented. Please understand me, she said. I haven't thought it through. I'm floundering about in an effort to be honest. If I run into an occasional logical impasse, I can't help it. I refuse to give up monogamy, Judge. That's what I've been trying to say all along. Oh, what do I mean? She finished with a despairing little laugh. Well, I said, let's see first what can be said for monogamy. For my part, I think monogamy is the ideal for people to work toward in marriage. They should achieve monogamy, both physically and spiritually, if possible. I think that in a marriage which represents the real union of a man and woman, they find each other so evidently preferably to anybody else, both physically and spiritually, that they fear inclination for sex experiences outside their technical monogamy 57 own marriage. They uniquely fill each other's lives. They are connoisseurs in love, they are so particular that nothing short of the authentic best, created by themselves to suit their own need and their own taste, can satisfy them. And such an authentic best, of course, is not often built out of casual contacts, it isn't the growth of an hour or of a whim. It usually comes to perfection slowly, like a tree. A lot of people discover for themselves the inferiority of substitutes for this slow-grown thing and they quit their foolishness after a very little experimenting. I have known many such. They seem to want to experiment largely because they have been told they mustn't. They think they feel a need, a repression, but that feeling is mostly an illusion. I agree absolutely, she exclaimed. I'm glad you see it, I continued. But if that is your ideal, why do you compromise with it? Why not live up to it? Personally, I have found it very satisfactory in my own marriage. Yes, she retorted, but that is because you and your wife wish it so and not because society wishes it on you. That's what I want. But my idea is that such an end can't be achieved by coercion, by prohibitions, by society saying, /feek shall, or by wives and husbands saying to each other, cudgjj Hyatt. The first thing to be had is freedom of choice. Everything valuable in human conduct has to flow from that. Am I right? If Henry and I achieve the kind of monogamy you speak of, it must be genuine achievement, and it must come into being because we genuinely want it and not merely because society says we must have it whether WTF want it or not. People who hold themselves to a technical monogamy when their heart and soul don't prompt them to it are not finding monogamy. Their hearts are not in it, whatever may be said of their bodies * they fool themselves. They shut their eyes to the facts, because society tells them it would be sinful candidly to admit the truth. Thus they achieve a fake. That's the way with thousands of marriages today. I simply won't have it that way. I don't like paste jewelry or other imitations of precious things. Monogamy is precious, and in its most perfect form it is it isn't to be had for the asking. It is a product of culture educated prefer * 58 ins. It must be made. It is, therefore, difficult, but I think most persons could achieve genuinely monogamous marriages, spiritually monogamous marriages, if society would give them a chance. I want such a marriage in my own life, and I refuse to be fully content with less. I think it can be attained by freedom of choice and the freedom, if necessary, to make mistakes, yes, even polygamous mistakes. I'd rather arrive at a monogamous marriage with my husband by that road than not arrive at all. Besides, I don't think either of us would run to the making of mistakes if we were free to make them. Freedom is the best preventive for that sort of thing. Of course you realize that given that sort of freedom, a lot of people would run amok, I observed. It would have to come gradually, she answered. In the meantime, why not reckon with people and their tastes and capacities as they are? I dote on Brahms and Beethoven, but I don't expect everybody else to conform to my musical standards. And so I say, why ram monogamy down the throats of people who either want it in some modified form, or who just naturally object to being made to do things, or who don't want it at all? Their tastes may not be highly cultured tastes, but they have a right to them. Also, they may not have married just the right person, and so circumstances may prevent them from achieving a truly monogamous marriage. If so, why deny them the right to better their condition if they can, so long as they don't violate other people's rights? It's all terribly complex, Judge, but freedom, surely that is simple. Your idea, then, I said, is that if the bars could be let down, everybody would stop jumping fences and would stay in the pasture. Is that it? They would find the right pasture and then they would stay put, she answered. They would stay because they liked the pasture. Why not? I think, I answered, that a long talk between you and your husband might serve a useful and possibly a monogamic purpose. I prescribe it. It might keep both of you in the pasture because you like it, as you suggest. I shall be interested to observe the outcome. Begging the question in Morals 5J. Thank you, Judge, she smiled. And if we are not here before long, you may infer that it is all right. Some months have passed, I have not seen them yet. 3. In this incident, as well as in the story of Mr. and Mrs. Blank, which I told a while back, there is food for thought. I am constantly in contact with indications which reveal a tendency on the part of conservative and conventional persons to experiment with sex traditions which they sincerely feel are in need of revision. Many would say that there is nothing new about that. But I hold there is. Adultery is ancient, of course, but this tendency to debate what has hitherto been undebatable is new. The tradition which forbids it is no longer being taken at its face value. This is a fact, and as such it must be faced. I strongly disagree with those who hold that it must be faced in a hostile spirit, or with an attitude of unqualified condemnation. If the old traditions are right, let them prove it by fighting their battle in the open, with fair field and no favor. I have been bitterly condemned for discussing such matters and for stating such facts, on the ground that no good purpose is served by such discussion and that it will simply encourage many persons to follow the example of the people I tell of. That is simply a begging of the question. It assumes that the old order is unqualifiedly right and that these efforts at change are wholly wrong. I don't agree. I think that point needs investigation of a very unprejudiced sort and discussion very much in the open. I do not pretend to say whether these new developments are right or wrong, though I recognize that many of them are dangerous. I do feel very sure, however, that the old order has in it plenty of room for improvement, and that by the efforts and, if you will, the mistakes, of such innovators as these, we may arrive finally at a sane readjustment of our sex code. What that readjustment will be, I don't know. It may and probably will turn out to be vastly different from the experiments of the Blanks and Ewings, but I don't see how we are to get it if there are no innovators to blunder and make mistakes while the 60 rest of us play safe and denounce and persecute. Progress has always been attained that way. That is why I value the strivings and the discontent that lead many such persons as these to break more or less with accepted codes. To say, as many do, that these people are merely actuated by lust and by their animal natures betrays a lack of understanding of the meaning and the values of sex which is characteristic of persons who hate the discomfort of thinking. It is a very complicated matter, and it can't be disposed of in any such offhand manner. The lives of thousands of well-intentioned, decent, well-balanced people are in a state of turmoil and tragic unhappiness because they are at odds with the existing sex code. To put this down to original sin is theological nonsense. What it means is that there is something wrong with the code, and that only by experimentation and discussion can we discover what it is. This is one of the most important problems before society, and yet there are tremendous, organized forces in this country bent on suppressing all honest and frank discussion of it. The reason for this book is this: if some persons have the courage to try to think out their own private conduct for themselves and run the risk of the social swats which our semi-barbarous civilization visits on such independence, then it is up to somebody to tell about it and discuss it with an open mind, and, if necessary, take the swats that may be expected to result from that. I may add here and now that I am getting them. They descend in the form of denunciatory letters, most of which refer largely to the Bible by chapter and verse, denunciations from certain types of ministers who shy at a fact as a bird does the net of the fowler, denunciations from editors, some of whom tell me privately that privately they are for me, but don't dare say so, denunciations, in short. For in the meantime, I find that I do not lack for distinguished company. The change now upon us is finding expression, not merely in the conduct and talk of obscure persons who are amateurs and novices in the field of ethics, but also in the writings of persons Bertrand Russell on jealousy 61, whose opinions are of the highest import. Bertrand Russell, for example, is one of the finest scientific and philosophic minds in England. One might disagree with his opinions, but nobody of any discrimination could treat them lightly. I quote from his recent book Education and the Good Life, one other thing in teaching children about sex love. Jealousy must not be regarded as a justifiable insistence upon right, but as a misfortune to the one who feels it and a wrong toward its object. Where possessive elements intrude upon love, it loses its vivifying power and eats up personality. Where they are absent, it fulfills personality and brings a greater intensity of life. In former days, parents ruined their relations with their children by preaching love as a duty. Husbands and wives still too often ruin their relations to each other by the same mistake. Love cannot be a duty, because it is not subject to the will. It is a gift from heaven, the best that heaven has to bestow. Those who shut it up in a cage destroy the beauty and joy which it can only display while it is free and spontaneous. Here, again, fear is the enemy. He who fears to lose that which makes the happiness of his life has already lost it. In this, as in other things, fearlessness is the essence of wisdom. For this reason, in teaching my own children, I shall try to prevent them from learning a moral code which I regard as harmful. Some people who themselves hold liberal views are willing that their children shall first acquire conventional morals and become emancipated later, if at all. I cannot agree to this, because I hold that the traditional code not only forbids what is innocent, but also commands what is harmful. Those who have been taught conventionally will almost inevitably believe themselves justified in indulging jealousy when occasion arises. Moreover, they will probably be obsessed by sex either positively or negatively. I shall not teach that faithfulness to our partner through life is in any way desirable, or that a permanent marriage should be regarded as excluding temporary episodes. So long as jealousy is regarded as virtuous, such episodes cause grave friction, but they do not do so where a less restrictive morality is accepted on both sides. Relations involving children should be permanent if possible, but should not necessarily 62 on that account be exclusive. Where there is mutual freedom and no pecuniary motive, love is good. Where these conditions fail, it may often be bad. It is because they fail so frequently in the conventional marriage that a morality which is positive rather than restrictive, based upon hope rather than fear, is compelled, if it is logical, to disagree with the received code in matters of sex. And there can be no excuse for allowing our children to be taught a morality which we ourselves believe to be pernicious. Among persons who have thought out their judgments less clearly than does Mr. Russell in the pregnant passage I have just quoted, the working of the social change to which he gives such clean-cut expression is a curious thing to watch. Thousands who feel the pull of the new conditions and influences lack the courage to say what they think. In fact, they deny that any such change is possible or desirable, and they enroll under the banners of conservatism with an end-clat that deceives the very elect. I know, for example, a physician in Denver who is outwardly one of the pillars of the old order. Women's clubs swear by him, social workers buzz around him, dowagers, alarmed about the younger generation, look upon him as a steadfast and a shining light that reveals always which is the path of virtue. He is a kingpin in one of the most important churches in Denver, and if anyone wants to put over radical ideas sufficiently cloaked in the mantle of respectability to win conservative support, they turn to the eminent Dr. Archibald Fellows for support, knowing that what he supports will be regarded as somehow safe and conservative by those who would sell their souls to the devil before they would abandon safety and conservatism. If Dr. Archibald Fellows were asked which passage in the above quotation from Bertrand Russell he most disapproved of, he would probably point to the part that reads, "I shall not teach that faithfulness to our partner through life is in any way desirable, or that permanent marriage is to be regarded as excluding temporary episodes." So long as jealousy is regarded as virtuous, such left-handedness of Dr. Fellows' 3 episodes cause grave friction, but they do not do so where a less restrictive morality is accepted on both sides. And he would point to other passages which he would pronounce almost equally offensive and equally evidential that the home is in grave peril. He would add that unless something is done about it, society is going to the bow-wows. I recall that once when a certain other Denver physician was prosecuted and convicted on the charge of having performed abortions, Dr. Archibald Fellows was a leader among the physicians of Denver in encouraging the prosecution that finally resulted in the man's conviction. A few months after this abortionist was safely behind the bars, where he could no longer be a social menace, Dr. Archibald Fellows personally performed an abortion on a young married woman whom he himself had made pregnant. He performed the operation in a very respectable Denver hospital, and he gave out to those who knew about it that the girl had been consorting with her divorced husband and had become pregnant that way. He continued till recently his intimacy with this girl, whom I know very well and who confided in me. He has a wife and a family of 4 very fine children. His home is a happy one, so far as I know. His intimacy with the girl of whom I have been telling arose as the result of her going to him for treatment. He cured her and then made love to her. He thereby violated, not merely the social code, but the ethical code of his own profession, of which he is a leading light. And by loudly demanding vigorous prosecution, he helped send another man to prison for doing unintelligently and clumsily what he himself thinks nothing of doing intelligently and skillfully. As a matter of fact, the real reason the abortionist was convicted by the jury was not that he had broken the law by committing an abortion, but that he had recklessly performed the operation on a woman so far advanced in pregnancy that she died as a result of what he did. "We just figured," said one of the jurors afterward, "that if he was such a reckless damn fool as that we'd better seal him up." 64 Personally I am strongly against abortion except when, for certain clear reasons, connected usually with health, it is unmistakably indicated. In the meantime the reader will not fail to note 2 things. First, that the jury was very little concerned with punishing abortion and sentenced the doctor for his recklessness and want of skill in practicing it. Second, that Dr. Archibald Fellows himself is apparently as little opposed to abortion as he is to other breaks with our established ways of thought and conduct. 13 men, one of them a reputable doctor, you see, secretly at odds with the code to which they still give outward assent. I know a doctor who performs in Denver an average of an abortion a day, mostly on married women, and I haven't a doubt that at an extremely conservative estimate, there are 1,000 abortions a year performed in Denver. For the benefit of those readers who demand why the doctors who perform these operations are not prosecuted, let me say that it is practically impossible to get women to testify in such prosecutions and that district attorneys give it up as a bad job except when the operation results, or threatens to result, fatally. Now in setting down such facts as these I do it without the slightest animus toward Dr. Archibald Fellows. Indeed, I regard him as an asset to the community, for he is an extremely competent physician. I have told about him because his case is typical. He is like thousands and thousands and thousands of others, in that his inner life, be it right or wrong, is different from his outer life. This fact he conceals. He has to. If he didn't he would lose caste. So he keeps up the sham. He secretly lives the thing he outwardly denies. He accepts and practices, in private, the views which he would pillory a man like Bertrand Russell for boldly expressing in public. In his secret conduct and in his secret convictions, he conforms, for instance, to what Mr. Russell suggests as feasible and possibly desirable in permanent marriage. In PMCA he regards faithfulness to one's partner in life as in no way desirable and he thinks permanent marriage should not be regarded as excluding temporary episodes. It is true that he apparently rejects Mr. Russell's suggestion that such episodes should be based on an honest mutual custom makes anything right 65 understanding between husbands and wives and that a less restrictive morality be accepted on both sides. But possibly that is not because he dissents from this view, but rather because he fears the consequences of trying to convert his wife. Like my friend Ewing, he would doubtless convert her if he could unless, as is quite likely, he is one of those males who hold to the double standard. 6. The point I want to make is this that people are doing these things, and that what they are doing constitutes the reality of this matter not what they profess in order that they may avoid social destruction. If this reasoning is correct, then I believe I have enough evidence to justify the conclusion, not that this change in our sex morals is going to take place at some time in the future, but that it has already largely taken place and is developing and crystallizing into a tacitly recognized and increasingly tolerated code. It is not that such practices are new or have never been known before, but that they have support from such a large segment of society. We have this thing among us now. It can't be stopped. And to me it seems evident that the only course open to persons who are capable of rational thought is to accept the change, help guide it wisely and transform it into a social asset as quickly as possible. In my judgment it is capable of becoming a social asset and it is capable of bringing joy rather than destruction into human life. Even the most casual survey of social history and of the growth and development of folkways into moral customs, demonstrates conclusively, not only that such changes can't be stopped, but that they usually meet some established social need and are therefore beneficent. They are not to be feared but to be welcomed. I don't see how anyone with the least capacity for honest thinking can ignore the fact that it is custom that makes this or that line of conduct right, in the eyes of society, regardless of whether it is truly ethical or not. We have many customs which are moral but which are also unethical. To show how irrational the whole business is, within the last 10 years we have had changes in women's dress, for instance, that were unthinkably 66 wrong formerly. Only lewd women wore clothes then which are accepted now as a matter of course by the most conservative and conventional persons. 15 or 20 years ago no decent woman could appear in a one-piece bathing suit. The police would have arrested her if she had done so. I remember how in those days a well-known actress appeared in a play, during one episode of which she was supposed to wear a bathing suit, a heavily skirted and properly elongated bathing suit, on the stage. Dramatic critics mentioned it. Great excitement along the Great White Way. New York, that now yawns at the nude beauties in the reviews, was interested. Would she dare do it? After a generous lot of publicity out of what her press agent had skillfully conveyed to the newspapers, the lady got around the difficulty by wearing a bathrobe, through the folds of which the bathing suit occasionally and coyly showed that it was there. None of us thought we were prurient fools, but that is the only word, I think, that can describe such a state of the public mind. Today a one-piece bathing suit could be used in any play on any stage in New York if the drama called for it, and it wouldn't bring a comment from anybody except hopeless cases that belong in asylums, or in psychiatric clinics. Young girls, clad in one-piece bathing suits, now swarm our beaches, glowing with health, brown from the sun, lovely in their unhampered grace, chaste in the unashamed and unafraid uses of their fine, strong bodies. Nor do they bring umbrellas for fear it will rain on their bathing suits. Rather they swim and dive in a way that should bring clean delight to the heart and mind of any healthy-minded person. But who started it all, and in the teeth of what protests from the virtuous prudes who follow suit, now that someone else has had the nerve to make it easy and safe? It was flappers who made these innovations in dress. Historians of the future will make due record of this fact and will trace many a vital social change back to it. The derided flapper has turned bathing naked in Japan 67 out to be a major determining factor in the changes I am discussing in this book. Who can forget the roar of disapproval the virtuous raised when the flappers raised their skirts even above the ankle line? How the morals of the innovators were called into question, and how, as we got used to it, we gradually discovered that we had been uttering unclean nonsense, and that this change in women's clothing was sane, reasonable, and clearly in the interest both of health and morals. Clothes, when used for concealment, are one of the most fruitful sources of the sex obsessions that possess us. For my part, I wish the day might come when we might strip every stitch from our bodies anywhere at any time without shame. If it were customary to expose the human body to public view, some of us would take better care of it, who need to, and would be less like what Carlyle called forked radishes. Women and men bathe together naked in Japan. It is right there because it is the custom. In this country some people are said to do it at wild parties. Thus, what is clean and lovely in Japan we transform into obscenity perpetrated in silver pigsties. It is interesting to note in this connection that thousands of ministers all over this country are beginning to defend the flapper and her innovations from the pulpit. I continually see in the newspapers accounts of sermons in which the Rev. Mr. So-and-so has pronounced the younger generation on the right track. There is hope for the church in that attitude of mind, and it is growing. What I am wondering is how long it will take the clergy to support other changes which they as fiercely denounce today as they once did those now moral modes of dress. The clergy have a great opportunity here, if they could only see it, and if they would take a chance on getting fired by their outraged congregations, whose leading members practice what they won't allow anyone to preach. 8. Thus the changes still go on, both in dress and in conduct, and still we have people who learn no lesson from the past, who absorb 68 no wisdom from history, and who kick consistently and steadily and stupidly at every latest phase of change, while they accept those phases which they have gotten used to. What applies so clearly in women's dress applies just as clearly in our sex code. That code is changing. In a few years the people who are holding up their hands in speechless horror at the demoralization which they see around them, will accept certain results of that demoralization as a matter of course, and in the same breath they will turn the guns of their wrath on some other change which is recent and therefore wrong. The facts which I am constantly observing lead me to believe that the day is not far off when these calamity howlers will find themselves acquiescing in a revolutionary conception of what marriage is and of what it is for. They will acquiesce in it because it will be custom and therefore right, and they won't have the least notion of the slow stages by which they got there after immoral people had done the dangerous work and made a broad highway for their tender feet and their flabby moral sinews. They don't know anything about covered wagons. They ride in automobiles and ballast pullmans. In that perhaps not very distant day, I think it quite possible that society at large will accept Mr. Russell's drastic statement, which seems so significant of the present social drift. 9. At the same time, there will come other changes. The conservatives of that day will accept the companionate marriage as a solution for men and women who want to live together without raising families, since legalized birth control and divorce by mutual consent for childless people will by then be the accepted thing. They may even accept the notion that people should be taught the facts of life, and that since love is what makes the world go round, it might be well to turn its enormous energy to some rational use, and that people should therefore be taught love as an art, not sex love merely, but love. For Mrs. Ewing spoke truly when she suggested that sex love is a worthless thing unless love be the source of it, and that men and women must love each other. Temples vs. Sedan 60 as personalities first and as men and women second, if sex is to retain permanent interest and freshness in their lives. Since love is an art, sex love is likewise an art. All persons, particularly young persons, should know this, and they should be taught in houses of human welfare, the biological and psychological essentials on which the activities of sex are based. To some the suggestion that sex love is an art and should be taught as such, will seem shocking. But the evidence that passes before me daily of the bungling and terrible stupidity and ignorance of men and women in their physical and spiritual relationships with each other is a far more shocking thing even than would be the old-fashioned pagan temple of Venus in every town in place of the present Ford sedan. I sometimes feel that 90% of the mountainous misery in the world is due to our lack of education in these matters. The ancients were not so wholly lacking in common sense about some things as are we, with our Puritan civilization and the tangle of pseudo-Christian theology which we are pleased to call religion. The ancients, some of them, at least perfectly understood the importance of giving some practical, direct, and unashamed attention to making effective, rather than abortive, the fact of sex. They solved it in their own fashion, a fashion which seems repugnant to us. Where we regard virginity in a bride as a pearl of great price, for instance, some of the ancients bluntly pronounced it a perilous thing. They had conventions, in fact, which forbade it in a bride. We have quite different and far more virtuous notions, hence the problem of sex ignorance is always with us. Some day we shall solve it, in our own fashion, a different fashion from that of the ancients, doubtless. And at present it is impossible to forecast what that solution will be. All that is certain is that some scientific and rational solution is needed. Chapter 4: The Green Eyes of Marriage. The papers were full, only the other day, of the story of wealthy man who shot his wife and then himself. The pistol lay on the floor between the two bodies. At first it was uncertain which had fired the gun and what was the cause of the quarrel. Later they found in the dead man's pocketbook the torn fragments of a letter written to his wife, a love letter from another man. To ask whether this husband would have killed his wife and himself if custom had not taught him the savage lesson that such was the traditional and proper course for any real man to follow in such circumstances is to answer it. Men and women have been taught that line of conduct from childhood, precisely as a high-class Japanese is taught from childhood that under certain conditions of conventional disgrace the only thing an honorable man can do is commit harakiri. He must not shoot himself nor take poison nor resort to drowning, mind you. The convention calls, not merely for suicide, but for suicide in a ritual manner, prescribed and painful. He must rip open his abdomen with a knife, hardly a quick or an easy death. We think such conduct senseless and irrational. When an American general loses a battle, for instance, our customs require nothing of the sort from him. We would consider it utterly preposterous. The conventional harakiri we think unworthy of intelligent human beings, and so it is, as judged by every reasonable standard of conduct that we in the Western world know anything about. And yet we prescribe and have prescribed in the past, other conventional courses which are equally unreasonable and irrational and unworthy of intelligent human beings. We grow up taking these 70 when murder is respectable 71 for granted as the proper thing to do if one has the nerve to do it. For instance, men used to stand up at a set distance apart and try to kill each other with sword or pistol if one had called the other a liar or a coward or had flung his glove in the other's face, or done some other thing which was supposed to snuff out the other man's honor as a puff of wind extinguishes a candle flame. Obviously the flame had to be relighted by a magic ritual, and the magic ritual was to fight a duel. A human life was thought to be a fit price for extinguishing or even causing to flicker the sacred flame of romantic honor. It didn't matter how evilly a man might live. He was honorable till he refused to fight someone who said he wasn't. In the event of such refusal he was a coward. Well, we don't duel anymore, not in America at least. We would call a killing in a duel murder and would treat it as such. We no longer have any romantic illusions about what dueling is. On the other hand, we still cling to the prompt and romantic use of a gun when infidelity shows its head in marriage. This hideous thing still remains among our sanctioned practices. It is, of course, contrary to our statute laws, but what are statute laws when they run counter to custom? It is founded in part on romantic love and in part on the rooted notion, still extant, that women are property and that marriage, on either side, confers the ownership of one's mate. Here is a tradition of whose respectability there can be no possible question, and yet it has no possible value this side of hell. It does not make men brave or women good. It merely makes beasts of us whenever we acknowledge that it has authority over us. For such sanctions as this are war, and war on any scale whatever, public or private, is an evil, degrading and needless thing. 2. The fact is that our marriage conventions, as they work out in the unwritten law, glorify jealousy and make a fetish of it. I believe that jealousy, taking the form of a claim to the exclusive ownership and possession of a mate, is the cause of most divorce 72 litigation whenever such litigation is based on a failure in the sex life of the parties involved. I am sure, too, that it is, directly or indirectly, the cause of 90% of the unhappiness in married life. Jealousy is simply another way of demanding one's place in the sun or under the domestic spotlight, a place in the center of the stage, as an exclusive object of consideration and attention. It is an impossible claim, when made by one human being on another, and human relationships are unworkable in its presence. At the very heart of this Christian but often very unchristlike civilization of ours, we place this ugly thing, this mother of lies and abominations, on a throne beside the domestic hearth, and in so doing we exalt selfishness, exclusiveness, fear, suspicion and raw egotism in the home to the position of cardinal domestic virtues. Jesus said that he who makes himself least becomes thereby the greatest, that he who takes the lowliest seat is called higher, that the meek inherit the earth, and that those who stand and serve become the lords of life. Life is builded on such spiritual paradoxes as these. But how can these paradoxical values of the spirit find their place in a marriage code which so often derives its authority and its compulsive control over human beings, not from the free will and mutual consent of the persons involved, but from jealousy? Let me define here what I mean by this word. Jealousy must not be confused with the perfectly natural desire to keep and hold an important and possibly a first place in the heart of a person whom one loves. It consists rather in a willingness and a determination to hold such a place regardless of that free and spontaneous mutuality so necessary to love. It is a wish and a determination to possess another. Unlike love, jealousy does not give first place to the happiness of its object. It gives first place rather to the desire and self-interest of the person who feels it its object, often cleverly disguised, is personal advantage. Jealousy is concerned with one's own happiness. Love is concerned with the happiness of the loved one. Jealousy has nothing to do with love. It masquerades as nature, red of tooth and claw 73 Jove. Animals often show it. It is common and instinctive even in very young children. Mothers often show it when their sons marry. The fact that it is biological does not justify it, for love is also biological and it is the higher law, since it makes for greater intensity of life. Jealousy belongs to nature, red of tooth and claw. In a thing so complicated as human life, jealousy is a triple distilled spiritual poison, and where sex relations are concerned it ruthlessly murders every other spiritual quality that can make marriage either practicable or desirable. I do not discount the fact that when two persons love each other unequally, so that the one pines for what the other cannot give, the situation is unfortunate and often tragic. But if love cannot be forced, that, surely, is no excuse for trying to force it. Such a course may be instinctive, but it is also irrational and wrong. We shall do well to face life as it is. I admit that it is not as we would like to have it. 3. When the word jealousy is used with respect to husbands and wives, it is usually taken to mean an unfounded and therefore mean and ignoble suspicion. Othello is a classic example of jealousy in marriage in that sense. But had Desdemona been in fact unfaithful, then we would not call Othello's emotional response jealousy, unless within some carefully restricted meaning of the word. Rather we would think of it as the legitimate rage, the righteous wrath of a wronged man, whose wife had played him false and whose friend had stolen from him a woman who was his particular and exclusive property, he being also hers, though less so. Under the stress of such righteous wrath, he might, with that sanction of custom called the unwritten law, properly kill her paramour, and then if intended for high tragedy kill himself. The customs now in force in our so-called civilization pronounce all this morally impeccable. If you don't believe me, try to assemble a jury that will pronounce guilty of murder the man or woman who slays in such a fit of traditional, customary, socially sanctioned, homicidal rage. I don't say that such a jury could not be found, 74, but it would be difficult, and a few decades ago it would have been all but impossible. The custom is changing, though slowly, and this change is extremely significant. I note that a jury in New York State has recently found guilty of murder a man who pleaded the unwritten law. Generally speaking, however, the fact stands that it would be hard to find a juryman, trying such a case, who would not feel that the person who did not experience such homicidal rage under such conditions was falling far short of his or her duty and was either a coward or a cold-blooded fish. And yet this attitude of mind is irrational and savage to the last degree. It assumes as a fact what is happily becoming less and less and less a fact, that one person can own and possess another person, as if anybody, under any conceivable human relationship, could have equities of so preposterous a nature. Such equities are fictitious, and the custom that has sanctioned them for ages has no genuine authority. That is why men and women in this age are beginning to snap their fingers at it. Phyllis, age 22, married Bert, who is 3 years older than she. The marriage took place 3 years ago. Phyllis had already come to me with her troubles, and she came to me immediately with this. She was sorry she had married him. She told me with tears that she did it on impulse. I felt I ought not to, she said, and I called you by telephone for an engagement to ask you what you thought. But you were out of town and here I am. Can't you annul the marriage, Judge? How can I, Phyllis? I said. You are over 21. If you were less than that I could probably free you. As it is, you will have to submit to the cumbersome divorce machinery by which the state makes it as impossible as it can for adults to get a divorce. Then she told her story. She had, as I knew, for a matter of 2 years had an affair with a man of 40 whom I will call Bell. Mr. Bell had wealth, social position, and education, and he was very different from the callow youths of her own age with whom she was used to associating. He was attracted to her by her beauty and her Phyllis and Bert 75 very real refinement. But he was married, and there could, therefore, be nothing in such an affair for Phyllis but disappointment. He wanted to divorce his wife and marry Phyllis, but as this would mean his ruin as a professional man, in Denver, he did not dare take such a step. At the same time, Phyllis's intimacy with him spoiled her for the crude love-making she encountered elsewhere. In the meantime, Phyllis ran around a good deal with young people of her own age. Among them was Bert, a young traveling man. Bert made violent love to her, she yielded, and whenever he was in town, about once in 3 weeks, their relations were of the most intimate sort. And under this arrangement they were both very happy. They had no quarrels, they parted reluctantly, and Bert returned again to her happily after his trips as a hardware salesman. While they were apart, neither tried to dictate to the other. Bert of course knew that she went out with their set. He also knew of her already established affair with Belle and that she confined herself to that. He knew also that other young men took her to dances and dinners. These things he took quite as a matter of course and with no manifestations of jealousy whatever. She on her part never thought of one restricting him in his association with other girls. So far as their life together was concerned, marriage could apparently make no difference in it. Had they been married, their routine would have been practically the same, since neither wanted children. Marriage, however, would make the difference that they could live together openly and that the tie would be recognized and permanent. Bert kept urging marriage and she finally consented against her better judgment. And now note what Phyllis said to me, before I married him. Judge, Bert was perfectly sweet and dear. I really loved him and he loved me and we were ever so happy when we were together. But now we're miserable. He wants me to travel around with him because he's afraid I'll go out with other men. I went out last night to dinner with 2 girls and 2 men and another fellow. There was nothing wrong with it. They were our old set *, but Bert would be furious if he knew it. He says he'll kill me and 76 himself if he ever finds that I have been unfaithful to him or I have anything more to do with Belle. He never used to say such things, but now he watches me all the time and he doesn't want me to go anywhere with anybody while he is away, or to have any pleasure. He'd like to lock me in a room when he starts on his trips and keep me there till he gets back. And he insists that I must give up my job and travel around with him. And I don't want to do that. Why should I, any more than before we were married? He can have me just as much now as he did then. Why were we happy then and unhappy now? Do you feel the same about Bert and other women? I asked. Of course. Why, I'd just die if I knew of his having anything to do with any other girl. I never felt that way till we got married. And now I'm so afraid about Mr. Bell. Why, if I should so much as look that way, I don't know but what Bert would go and shoot him. And, Judge, one reason why it might be better for me to travel with Bert is that Mr. Bell is sure to call me up as soon as he gets back from this trip he is on to New York. And if he does well, I'm afraid I can't resist him. He'll want me. I know he will, and I think as much of him as I ever did. He's different from all the others. Oh, if I could have married him. And, oh, if I hadn't married Bert. I'm so wretched. And now if I stay and Mr. Bell comes back and Bert ever finds out, he'll shoot, I know he will. If only he'd let me step out. And what about you? I demanded. Would you let him step out? I should say not. She exclaimed. If he stepped out, I'd just about die. I'd go mad with jealousy. I know it's unreasonable, but I can't help it. You helped it before you married him, but you can't help it now. Is that it? Yes. And now you 2 young fools are engaged in watching each other and preventing each other from doing what you each want to do yourself. Now, Phyllis, listen to me. It goes without saying that you must keep away from Belle. When we married Bert, you knew I would insist on that, and unless you had an understanding with Sauce for Goose and Gander 7. Him to the contrary, your marriage constituted a clear-cut agreement to quit Belle. But Bert's insistence that you must not run around with your friends in his absence is all wrong. If he will have it that way, he'll drive you to things you would never have thought of. Your marriage must not start on such a basis. If it does, you'll be on the rocks in no time. You and Bert must face this issue and be reasonable in your demands on each other. Since you both equally demand faithfulness of each other, you must both be prepared to deliver in that respect right up to the hilt. Your jealousy of Bert in regard to other women, coupled as it is with your speculations about going back to Belle, is a preposterous thing. If you 2 can't be good sports and observe the elements of fair play and decency and honesty in dealing with each other, there is no destination for you short of the divorce court. I don't attempt to tell you what you can and cannot do. What arrangement you and Bert make between you in this matter is your own affair. But you must arrive at an understanding of one sort or another and then abide by it. It must be voluntary on the part of both of you, and you must carry it out to the letter, not because somebody else says so but because you want to. If you and Bert don't care enough for each other to be square with each other, then the sooner you quit and go your ways, with divorce or without it, the better for both of you. I would think your present selfish behavior toward each other, each of you trying to take all and give nothing, was little short of caddish if I didn't realize how bewildered you are by the situation and by your own defective training and education in these difficult matters. The fact is that you are both the victims of the traditions you were brought up in. It's a subjective habit. You'd better be careful how you try to break with it. In the meantime, I am sure that when you realize that all you and Bert need do is play fair, you will be far on the road to being happy together. Bring him up here and let's have a talk. 5 later I talked with Bert. I found him a nice enough boy turned into a jealous young pup by the notion that having married a girl 78 he must begin exerting the traditional authority of a husband. He had the support of our conventions in this, and it had never remotely occurred to him that he might be wrong, or that he could possibly take any other attitude. He accepted it unquestioningly. Phyllis, of course, had equal backing in her jealousy from a tradition only a little different from that which actuated Bert. The situation amounted simply to this: formerly these two had been happy because the conventions in which they live and move and have their being permitted them to be J. This didn't mean that either of them felt free to indulge in sex orgies, but simply that whatever restraints they chose to place on their conduct were of their own making and in accord, more or less, with their own sense of what was fitting and proper. They may have made mistakes in deciding what was fitting and proper, but they at least made their own decisions and their conduct flowed genuinely from that. Under this system of deciding their own conduct and making their own moral decisions, they got along, on the whole, pretty well. Moreover, they were fairly responsible in all that they did. They were willingly subject at all times to the feeling that among the things they must not do were things which evidently worked injury to other persons. In matters where they thought no injury to others was involved, they generally did as they chose and even violated the sex conventions without feeling that it did harm either to themselves or anyone else. Such was their view as it worked out in practice. I don't mean that they consciously analyzed it as I have done, but that they acted on it and that it worked reasonably well for them, without ruin or disaster or unhappiness. Very good. Such was the situation while they were unmarried. With marriage the situation completely reversed itself. They became immediately unhappy. They immediately began forbidding each other to do things which formerly they had done as a matter of course and in which they had never thought of restraining each other. The convention of marriage, which they accepted at its face value as a thing to be acted on without question or debate, stepped in and created between these two an attitude of mind which proved ** virtue by mutual coercion 79 tip to their happiness. They didn't need such an attitude of mind, they had gotten along without it hitherto *, but now they were both saddled with it. And it transformed what they had thought was good into something whose fruits were unmistakably evil. On the one hand, the unwritten law laid certain obligations on Bert. As a self-respecting male, it had now become his duty to defend his home and his honor and his marriage bed, and if anybody slipped past his guard, then he must shoot things up. He didn't question this. FW men do. Phyllis, on the other hand, was under a similar set of traditional obligations, somewhat modified. She had been taught and had always taken for granted, that other women would rob her of Bert if he should pay too much attention to them. Bert had only so much love to give, and what he gave to anyone else necessarily meant deprivation for her. That there was something self-contradictory in this view of the matter she might have suspected from her own earnest affirmation to me that her liking for Belle did not make her think any the less of Bert. She really believed this, but she couldn't see how such a thing might logically work both ways. She was more than willing to continue with Belle, but she was crazy jealous at the thought of Bert taking a similar liberty with some other woman. Bert was her husband and she owned him and wanted exclusive possession, even while she resented his wanting exclusive possession of her. She would watch, and if Bert formed any outside attachments, she proposed to raise hell. Those were her words to me. 6. So here they were, each longing, like an imprisoned bird, for something they had both given up. They wanted the old freedom, the old sense of personal independence which had formerly been as the breath of life to them. They wanted it for themselves, though they would not grant it to each other. Something had stepped in and said, "No more of that. You own each other now, and all these things you have liked and enjoyed, you must henceforth forbid each other regardless of whether you mutually and of your own will, renounce them in your hearts or not." I submit that the reaction against a thing like that is inevitable, natural, and to be expected. It is utterly impossible to impose such restraints on people from without and not thereby create the internal feeling that the restraints are not reasonable. Resentment and rebellion are immediately in evidence, and these form a direct incitement to unconventional behavior. Before marriage, the personal life of these two was ruled, as I have said, by promptings and restraints that came from within and were voluntary. It was not perfect, but it was genuinely authoritative so far as it went. After marriage, Bert substituted his commands for Phyllis's internal system of self-control, and she imposed hers on him in the same manner. Thus an invalid and ineffective kind of restraint replaced what had, in T's way, been an effective and genuine personal code, a code which was effective and genuine simply because it was created by Phyllis and Bert within their own hearts for their own personal use. I am not saying it was an adequate code, or that it might not have been much improved. Merely say that they obeyed it because they had made it. There is no other way in which human conduct can have any ethical quality whatever. That any code, be it a marriage code or what you please, should thrust out of people's lives a thing which, though imperfect, is genuine and substitute what is not genuine at all, is an outrage so unspeakable that I can find no words in which to denounce it adequately. If it were not for this damnable interference by society in the private lives of Phyllis and Bert, they could have lived together in marriage just as happily as they did before marriage. In fact, they would have been much happier in marriage than out of it, and their marriage would then have justified itself by giving them a fuller union in each other than before. Furthermore, they would both have been much more likely to forego outside sex relations and to lose all desire for them. As it was, the tight rein they kept on each other was a constant reminder of things forbidden, and it aroused the very desires it was intended to quench. If these two could have persuaded themselves to forget that they were married, if they could have wiped it out of their minds by tearing up their marriage certificate, and if they could then, mentally turning each other loose, 81 have gone back to the old free relationship and picked up the threads of the old free intimacy and resumed their respect for each other's personalities and each other's rights, they could have made a successful marriage of what was otherwise doomed to failure. As it is, they have now struggled along bravely for 3 years. I have done what I can to set them right, but some persons can't think past a convention. Unconventional before marriage, because unconventionality was the convention of their social set, they are furtively unconventional now because furtive unconventionality is also the convention of their set. They must not be honest. Goodness, no. How shocking. That would not be conventional. Instead, they must watch each other and forestall each other, while they each play the game of slipping by with something. And they do it. Phyllis went back to Belle, and Bert secretly indulges in his own affairs on the side, and so the tension grows. Each furiously suspects the other, and neither is willing fearlessly to accord to the other the liberty which was once as the breath of life in the nostrils of them both. I feel confident that if they had the courage and good sense to turn each other loose, so to speak, regardless of temporary consequences or of the first excessive rebound after so much restraint, they would presently find each other, no matter how many persons had apparently come between them. I think they would find their married intimacy, their mutual sympathy and their bond of interest in each other so infinitely superior to any substitute they could find in outside relationships that they would cease their outside affairs from sheer indifference and ennui. The interest they now take in philandering would transfer itself to their marriage, and the boredom they now feel toward their marriage would transfer itself to their philandering, where it belongs. But at present they are very far from this consummation. Their condition is quite otherwise. And marriage, as we have it and as we conceive it, has done this thing to two persons whose minds have not been keen enough to penetrate the fact that society has not really married them at all and that it has palmed off a fake on them. 82 They wanted bread and they have been given a stone. Society is doing this thing to thousands whose minds seem to be no keener. There are yet others, however, who are beginning to see that a cast iron morality cannot take the place of genuine ethics, and some of these are repudiating the fraud and are experimenting with honesty and common sense in its place. This does not mean that they are discarding marriage. We shall never discard marriage. But they are beginning to insist that the thing be real. Please understand me. I am speaking of honesty and common sense. I am not suggesting, directly or indirectly, that honesty and common sense point the way to philandering in marriage. Nor do I say they might not do so. I merely suggest that honesty and common sense are requisite no matter what they lead to and that they must be accepted unconditionally as a basis for effective marriage. They may turn the world upside down for all I know, but I still maintain that honesty and common sense have a first claim on human loyalty. I suggest further that the proper view for society to take of this matter is to recognize that some persons have an inclination toward varied sex experiences and that some haven't, and that it is no function of society to discriminate against those who have such inclinations provided they duly respect and consider the genuine rights of other people. Within that limit, their conduct is as much a personal matter, to be personally determined, as the choice of one's politics and religion. An honest personal code which duly considers the rights of other people and which submits voluntarily to whatever internal restraints are necessary for the observance of such rights, constitutes a very large order, believe me. Such a code is about as far removed from irresponsible license as could well be imagined. Its tendency would be to impose on the individual stricter and more genuine restraints than anything dreamed of in our conventions. Let me now offset the story of Phyllis and Bert with the story of Phyllis's best friend, Esther, and of Esther's divorced husband, Archie, and her second husband, Bob. Esther, Archie, and Bob 83-8. Esther, Archie, and Bob are intimate friends of Phyllis and Bert, 5 of them run together inseparably. And the difference in their fundamental point of view is all the more remarkable on that account. Esther married Archie at about the same time that her friend Phyllis married Bert. Archie, whom I have known for years, is a very fine boy, steady, hard-working, effective in all he does, well-balanced, and gifted with the kindliness of nature which is a part of his stable and dependable make-up. In him Esther had picked a winner. Esther knew this. She valued his fine qualities. She had chosen him in preference to Bob, who had also wanted to marry her. But after she tied up with Archie she began to repent. She realized that Archie was the finer of the two boys and that he was in every way more worthy of her love than was Bob, but, as she told me later, there seemed to be a fundamental incompatibility which left her ill at ease when she was with him. They had different natures and a different point of view. They talked a different language. It was not that they quarreled, but rather that they had little in common. With Bob, on the other hand, she was always at her ease and perfectly happy. He never treated her as well as Archie did. He lacked Archie's fineness and chivalry, his considerateness, and his innate courtesy. He treated her in the offhand fashion women usually detest. He neglected her when he felt like it. And yet she fell in love with Bob. Archie presently took note of the fact that she was very largely in Bob's company. She went to shows with Bob. They found this and that excuse to be together. Bob was often at the house. At last Archie said to her, "Esther, do you think you'd be happier with Bob than with me?" She admitted that she would. "All right," said Archie, "get a divorce from me and marry him. In the meantime, do as you please." In due time she brought suit for divorce. They got by without the collusion being detected and without otherwise betraying the fact 84 that they were in cahoots. At last the interlocutory decree was granted. The final decree was to follow 6 months later, another senseless obstacle. In the meantime, Esther and Bob had been living together secretly, though with Archie's knowledge, and when the final decree was granted, Esther was already pregnant by Bob. I married them a few months later. Shortly before the birth of this baby, Archie gave a dinner party to his divorced wife Esther, now very obviously on the verge of motherhood. He invited Esther, Bob, Phyllis, and Bert. It was a thoroughly amicable occasion. 9. A woman to whom I told these two contrasting stories about these 5 persons said, "You imply in this last story that because Archie left his wife free to follow her inclination and finally marry another man, everybody was happy." I admit that his conduct seems to have made possible the avoidance of a lot of trouble. But what I want to know is, where does Archie get off? Archie had rights. Of course, if he didn't care about Esther and was willing to let her go, that's another thing. But assume that he really loved her and then found that she cared for another man. It seems to me that there are limits to what human nature can reasonably be expected to put up with. And I can't see that such an outcome provides Archie with the happiness he has a right to, assuming of course that he loved his wife and wanted to keep her. It looks to me as if in such a situation he had a right to be jealous and put up a fight and assert his intention to fight off any man who might try to deprive him of the woman he loved. I have no doubt that this same view of the matter will occur to many of my readers. I answer it this way: if he loved her and wanted to keep her, the losing of her was a regrettable tragedy in his life. Such tragedies happen. We can't any of us help it. And in marriage, no matter how hard people try to pick the right mate, some of them make mistakes. Esther thought she loved Archie, because, recognizing his superior qualities, she thought she ought to love him, in preference to Bob. She made an honest mistake. Erotic avarice 8 *. In this situation Archie had a perfect right, if he loved her, to want to keep her and to be first in her life. That goes without saying. But that desire is not jealousy. The point I make is that he was free from jealousy and that he put her happiness before his own wishes. A jealous husband would have tried to hold her because such a course fell within his conventional and legal rights. Archie had a sweetness of nature that made the course he took easier for him than it would be for some. Besides, it is quite possible that when he found Esther didn't care for him, his own feelings toward her underwent a change. But whether they did or did not, it in no way alters the significance of what he did. He accorded to another human being the freedom of action we should all be prepared to accord to other human beings, so long as such freedom does not infringe on other people, rights. And you will note that in this case he did not feel that she was violating his right of ownership, as most men would have done. If there had been children, the rights of those children would have been involved, and in that event the case would have had a different aspect. Esther's freedom would have been limited by the right of a child to both its parents. Quite another thing, you see a real right instead of a fictitious one. In that case I don't know how they would have worked it out. Probably Archie and Esther would have continued their home with Bob entering in as a tertium quid. I know such a case in Denver right now, a wealthy couple. Only yesterday I saw them on the street. The husband was walking on ahead with a lovely 4-year-old child tripping along beside him, her hand in his. The wife followed. She was accompanied by tertium quid. I am not commending the arrangement. I merely say that the thing happens and that these people seem to find it satisfactory. Before they arrived at the present understanding they were both miserable, as I happen to know. Some persons would consider such a solution impossible and repugnant. But some persons don't. We differ in these matters, apparently, as we differ in politics and religion. I really don't see why Denver society should interfere with these people, or judge them, or ostracize them. But it would do just that if it knew 86 what I know. And among the people who would do the ostracizing would be many who also would be ostracized for this reason, or that if they got found out, by people who, in their turn, would be ostracized if etc. What a merry-go-round. In the long run the value of this or that kind of human behavior has to be determined by the test of human happiness. The stand society takes against such irregular domestic relations as I have been describing is based on the belief that that kind of thing if generally practiced would disrupt society. Some think God prohibits it and that he does it for just that reason. but society has not yet gotten to the point where it can see that anger, hatred, malice, jealousy, and the like are far more destructive to human happiness than any amount of sex irregularity. I don't say the old view is all wrong. I merely say that it needs some sort of revision and that it can make no just claim to being exempt from such revision. Present results do not support such a claim. And until such a revision shall have been worked out, I think it behooves us all to be tolerant of those who are finding their way out as best they can. Perhaps they are contributing to the revision. I think it would be preposterous to say that their conduct is wholly antisocial or wholly without value. Such persons are at least doing something. Perhaps they think there is something to the saying that heaven helps those who help themselves. But to come back to this phenomenon that my friend Ewing called erotic avarice, I know a man named Harris. He is separated from his wife. She said to me once, "Mr. Harris can go his own way, and he can have affairs with as many women as he likes, so long as he continues to provide me and the children with that $200 a month he has agreed to." Such is her view. Now note his view. Sometime after the separation, Harris found his wife sitting on another man's lap. Unmindful of his own affairs with other women, he flew into a terrific rage. His wife was his property. He neither used it nor cherished it himself, but he was quite clear that nobody else must touch it. He, being a man, might have outside affairs and it would make no difference. A French episode 87. But for a woman to behave so, that was different. Enter the twin bugaboos, purity and impurity. A woman recently separated from her husband said to an officer of my court, "I am glad to be separated from my husband at last. I don't love him. In fact, I hate, detest and abominate him. But if he wants a divorce, I shall refuse to let him have it. I won't have him marrying any other woman. He shan't have that satisfaction, ever, if I can prevent it." 10. Mrs. Lindsay and I were once dining with a delightful French family. It consisted of a mother, her daughter, her son, and the son's wife, a bride. The son was well up in the 20s and this bride was somewhat younger. They all spoke very good English, which they courteously used as their exclusive medium of conversation because Mrs. Lindsay and I do not speak French. With us was an English friend who knew these people very well and who is familiar with French customs. In the course of the evening this interesting family branched off, still speaking English, into conversation among themselves concerning a private matter. And we could hardly believe our ears when this respectable French dowager, a woman of first-rate social position, suddenly began vigorously reproaching her son for neglecting Annette. "Annette," murmured our English friend, grinning discreetly, "is this chap's mistress." If the reader will try to imagine some stately matron in middle life, a leader in the social affairs of his hometown, publicly reproaching her son at a dinner party on such a ground as this, he may get some idea of the mixture of amusement and interest we took in this situation. The young man began to make lame excuses. It was clear that he felt himself very much in the wrong. There wasn't a doubt that he had been neglecting Annette. His sister put in indignantly, "You haven't been near her, for months." "It is not right," put in the mother. "When we return home you must not neglect her so, Henry. She has been so good to you always. That is the way with Henry," she added, turning to me, "always careless and irresponsible." And turning up her eyes, she shrugged in the inimitable French manner. "Ever so careless about much," said the little bride, shaking her bead sternly at her husband and yet smiling. "I have told him he must think of her and not neglect her, but will he listen? None." Utterly bewildered by all this, I turned to my English friend for help. "Am I getting this straight?" I asked under my breath. He nodded. "It's one of their little ways," he said. "He has kept Annette for years, with money furnished, of course, by his mamma. The girl is below him in station. A Frenchman of position picks for his mistress a girl who is not his social equal. You can see for yourself that his wife is not jealous. But let him choose a woman of his own social rank, then you'd see the fur fly, and they wouldn't be talking and shrugging about it as if they classed it with the weather. As it is, they think a lot of the girl and they propose to look after her interests. Even the bride, I murmured. He chuckled. Even the bride? Charming, eh? And no jealousy. Later, when we could talk above a whisper, he observed, now in England we see these things differently. A high-class Englishman regards the psychological satisfactions of sex. As a rule, the woman with whom he has an intimacy must be intellectually and spiritually congenial. He would derive little satisfaction from a woman who was merely a body, so to speak. That is why such liaisons in England are likely to be between social equals. And of course they are usually secret. And yet I think this English view, which is also your American view, accords a much greater dignity to sex. We English require more of sex, spiritually, than does a Frenchman. Perhaps, he added, there should be a calm asterisk promise between the 2 points of view. The French have much to teach us and we have something to teach them. In relating this incident, I don't vouch for the interpretation placed upon it by my English friend. Personally, I know little about when to bundle was a virtue 89 French customs. I simply record the happening for what it is worth and for the light it sheds on certain of our own customs. It may have been merely an individual example rather than the custom of the country, as my English friend affirmed. But at all events it happened. The moral of this little story is plain. What IFC means, if it means anything, is that custom can make anything right in the eyes of society and that it can make anything wrong / asterisk, and that the sooner we get over our superstitious reverence for the authority of custom as custom, divinely sanctioned and established with the beginnings of time, the better for all of us. 2. It used to be the custom in the North American colonies in the 17th century for courting, among perfectly respectable persons, to be carried on in bed. A pair who might or might not contemplate marriage spent the night in bed together, partly dressed. This was simple courtship, equivalent to sitting together on a divan now, and it was binding on neither party unless the couple violated the convention under which it was permitted and the woman became pregnant. In that event marriage was expected, then as now. This custom was known as bundling. Other names for it were tarrying and questing. It was practiced as a matter of expediency because of the scarcity of beds and fuel. It made for comfort. Husbands, as a matter of course, permitted travelers, stopping at their homes, to bundle with their wives and daughters, and it was proper to ask for the privilege. Bundling was regarded as innocent, and it usually was. Young people, then as now, were supposed to be able to behave responsibly without a chaperone. Ministers finally began preaching against the custom, but conservative parishioners stoutly resisted all attempts at change. When sofas were introduced, about 1750, after more than a century and a half of bundling, conservative persons pronounced the sofa improper and insisted on their daughters and their suitors retiring to bed instead. Sofas, said they, were an incitement to irresponsible conduct. My reason for telling of this custom is to demonstrate once 90 again what custom can do toward legitimizing any practice which society, whether to save firewood and beds, or for whatever other reason, finds expedient. Such facts contain a wholesome shock for our self-satisfaction and our smugness. They are disillusioning. They demonstrate that, outside the range of genuine ethics, allowable conduct is simply conduct which society, for any reason whatever, chooses to permit, and that unallowable conduct is conduct which, for reasons equally arbitrary and often irrational, society chooses to forbid. Sometimes allowable conduct is outrageously unethical. It is nevertheless right in the eyes of society. Sometimes perfectly ethical conduct is a violation of conventional morality. Such conduct is always wrong. Bundling was right once, it is wrong now and contrary, the average moralizing minister would tell you, to the will of God. Our present marriage customs are just as much a matter of expediency as was bundling. They have the same degree of divine sanction, and like bundling they may be expected to last so long as they work. When they fail to work, a few rebels will start changing them, as some are now doing, then the crowd will follow this lead, and God, somewhat belatedly, will be found by his interpreters to have changed his mind. The new custom will then be the will of God so long as it works. This epitomizes the whole process by which customs come into existence and then give way to other customs. We should do well to rationalize the process. By so doing we might spare ourselves a great deal of needless crime, tragedy, and unhappiness. In the meantime, we are given to understand that marriages are made in heaven. I admit that some might have been. But as to others, why blame them on heaven? Above all, why blame the jealousy tradition, that curse of matrimony, on heaven? Any custom that gives two free persons the ownership of each other is a device of the devil. Heaven has nothing to do with it. It is a worse offense against ethics than all the infidelity in the world, and it destroys more marriages than all the adultery ever committed. The capital crime against marriage is not infidelity, which is the story of Stanley Hubble 91 ground for divorce in some states, but jealousy, which isn't a ground for divorce anywhere. 12. Among the most interesting confidences I have ever received in connection with my domestic relations work, I count the story of a man who had come to see me in behalf of his sister, but wound up by telling me a story about himself. His sister was having trouble with her husband because, to her highly virtuous mind, sex was a thing repulsive and unclean. Her husband had sought consolation elsewhere. However, that is another story. It happened that I already knew Stanley Hubble very well, and our consultation about his sister's troubles led us to a discussion of the general problem of possessive jealousy. And presently he began to tell me about himself and how he had once saved his own home by putting jealousy out of his life. A few years ago he married a woman whom I have since come to know. She is very lovely, a strong and splendid soul in a beautiful body. He had had to display considerable enterprise to win her, for her suitors had been many. I have never been able to understand, Hubble said to me, why Alice chose me instead of some one of those men who would have provided her with wealth and comfort beyond anything she could wish. They were many of them fine fellows. She could have had anything. Yet she chose me. I can only wonder and be thankful that women are not always logical. Well, shortly after our marriage, some curious things happened. You can judge their significance for yourself. Alice and I were married in Denver, and we went immediately from here to San Francisco, where I had business. My friend, Will Carson, accompanied us on that trip. He had been best man at the wedding, and while I was courting Alice, he had exerted himself at first to further my cause. He had shown her many courtesies. I did not learn till later that when he thought she might not accept me and that my fortunes appeared uncertain, he fell madly in love with her himself. With him in Denver was another friend of mine and his Tekin 92 Ryan. Tom, as I learned later, fell in love with her too. Neither man admitted his thoughts to the other, but on the theory that all is fair in love and war, each tried to win her favor. Tom was a bachelor, but Will was married, to a very rich girl whom he did not love. Such was the situation when Will and Alice and I took the train to San Francisco. After we had been in San Francisco a few days, I was obliged to make a trip from there which involved an absence of 3 days. I left Alice at the hotel, where Will also had a mite. The next evening he took her out to dinner, during which he made undue use of a hip flask. When they returned to the hotel he paused at the door of his suite and leaned against the wall, saying I felt faint. Alice, much concerned, took him by the arm and helped him into his room, whereupon he whirled about, locked the door and began to make violent love to her. Violent is the word. He had, as I have said, been drinking. I suppose that accounted for the fact that a terrific physical struggle followed. She happened to be very strong and was able to resist effectively. But even at that, she emerged from the struggle with her hair down, her clothes torn and a diamond pin she had been wearing broken to bits, with the stones scattered over the floor. By some miracle they had not been heard. She finally escaped and went to her room. The next morning she met him at breakfast as if nothing had happened, with a calm good morning. Later he came to her, abjectly apologetic. He wept, he berated and bitterly reproached himself, he begged her pardon and altogether exhibited the most extreme signs of repentance. She forgave him. But when I returned she told me what had happened. Now figure it out for yourself. What was the traditional thing for me to do? Well, I didn't do it. I thought it over and I never indicated to Will Carson in any way, never have to this day, that I knew a thing about it. I have reason to think that he suspects I know. I also know that he is today one of my most devoted ones and that Alice and I have both his respect and his loyalty. Tom is in love with me 93. I'm sure he still loves her, but I don't blame him for that. I think that is better than shooting him. It was not long after this that Tom Ryan came into the picture. When we returned to Denver, Tom was there. He began calling at the house constantly. He came frequently in my absence. Of all this Alice said nothing, but I suddenly began to realize that Tom was mad about her and that it stood to reason he was not keeping the fact to himself. Tom was a fine, big, handsome chap, a fascinating personality. It would not have been strange had he attracted her. One evening Alice said to me, "Tom thinks you are away. He is going to call me by phone this evening and ask me to go riding with him in his car. Would you object to my going?" "Not at all, dear," I said. "That's all right with me. You are a free person." "Tom is in love with me," she continued, calmly. "He will want to make love to me and he will probably want me to run away with him. Suppose, Stanley, I let him make love to me and suppose I decided to go away with him. What would you do?" If that suited you, it would be all right with me," I said. "I don't own you. I merely love you and I want you to be happy / well, Judge, I wish you could have seen her." She sat there with an enigmatic, Mona Lisa smile on her lips. I swear I couldn't make out whether she was tempted by Tom or not, or whether she would go or stay. But I stood by my guns. Whatever else would keep her, I knew no assertion of ownership would. And yet I had doubts. Some women, you know, resent it if a man doesn't show jealousy under such conditions. They interpret it to mean that he doesn't care. And sure enough, that was the next thing she shot at me. "You don't seem to be jealous," she said. "Does that mean that you don't care?" "You are too intelligent really to mean that question, Alice / I said. "I do care. But my caring has nothing to do with it. My respect for you as a person, with the rights of a person, has everything to do with it." 94. And still she sat with that enigmatic smile on her face, and I watched her and wondered. Pretty soon the telephone rang. "That will be Tom / she said, glancing at the clock. And she took down the receiver. "Oh, is that you, Tom? Good evening. So glad you called up. Surely. A drive would be delightful. I have just told Stanley that you had suggested it and you know how he does love to drive. When will you be over?" Tom arrived a half hour later. He was his usual urbane self and drove us 40 miles before he brought us home game to the last. He doesn't suspect that, I know, but he never tried it again. Now how long do you think it would have taken me to have driven her into the arms of a man like that if I had followed the traditional course? She stayed absolutely of her own will under no compulsion from me. As for the other men, they had a right to win her if they could, say I. Of course Will Carson's methods were outrageous, but aside from that, I say it's up to me to hold her because I hold her love and in no other way. And if she had yielded to them and then come back to me, FD feel the same. To my way of thinking, so long as she loves me, nothing she might give to them would rob me of her. As it happened, she was not tempted. But that was a matter of temperament and inclination. Had she been tempted, it would have been the same. What she wanted to do or wanted not to do lay equally within her rights. I claim nothing and I have everything. I would still have everything had she seen fit to confer on one or both of those two men what they wanted. And had she gone to one or the other of them and left me, I would have had nothing, which is precisely what I would have had anyway had I held her by possessive jealousy. Some would call this a spiritless philosophy, Judge, but I think it takes nerve and courage to put it through. Jealousy is a kind of cowardice. It will go to any extremity in its effort to avoid the truth and pretend that facts are not facts. I refuse to yield to it. So much for Hub Elp's end of the story. A few years after my talk with him, I met Will Carson on a train during a trip to Chicago. I knew him fairly well, though not so well as Hubble, but before Carson's story 95 the trip was over, we were on more or less confidential terms, so much so that he opened up with a tale which, I confess, I more or less paved the way for, and which was substantially in accord with that which Stanley Hubble had told me. You know, said Carson in conclusion, I think Stanley knows what happened. And yet he has never said a word about it. I am received at their home and they seem to think a lot of me. Only Alice never sees me alone. I don't think Stanley holds any grudge or resentment. In fact, I sometimes think he sympathizes with and understands the impulse that overwhelmed me. All I can say is that I don't get it. I don't think I would be capable of such conduct if the situation were reversed. He has shown a nobility and a reasonableness in his view of this matter that is beyond me. And it's from no lack of ability to assert himself or put up a fight, either. Later, Carson learned that Hubble did know. They remain fast friends. From this double-barreled story the reader may draw his own inferences. To me it means, among other things, that the most important thing about a man is his philosophy. The reader will, of course, note the significance of certain of these stories in their relation to each other. The union of Phyllis and Bert was a success before their legal marriage and a failure after it, because marriage introduced into their relations with each other restraints which they did not like and which, in their case, did not make for happiness and contentment. In other words, whatever may be said in favor of the monogamous ideal, it has in this instance, when forced on a couple who find it repugnant and irksome, failed to make marriage either livable or endurable. The theory on which society maintains monogamy in marriage is T&T. No other relationship in marriage makes in a like degree for happiness, but Phyllis and Bert lived together for some time in a non-monogamous relationship, before their legal marriage, and they were happy in it. Apparently, then, there are people so constituted that monogamy does not meet their temperamental needs, and the 96th question is, can society wisely or successfully force such persons to accept the monogamous ideal whether they like it or not? I think it cannot. The effort of society to forbid and prevent outside episodes in all marriages is precisely the thing which seems to have wrecked this particular union, since it was a successful union previous to the time when law and custom introduced that restriction into the relations of this couple with each other. In other words, the marriage of Phyllis and Bert apparently contained elements which were capable of making a success of it under conditions not sanctioned by our conventions. The marriage of Archie and Esther, on the other hand, lacked the success element. It was no true marriage because Esther did not love her husband. It was not possible to make a real marriage of this union, monogamous or otherwise. In putting an end to it, therefore, Archie made it possible for Esther to find elsewhere the happiness she could not find in her marriage with him. He also left open for himself the possibility that he would later find happiness with someone else, and he provided for Bob's happiness besides. Thus, instead of making 3 people miserable, he made 3 people happy. He did it, however, by running counter to what society deems right. According to those who believe in what they call the sacredness of marriage, Archie should have stood by his guns and made them all miserable. At the most he and his wife should have separated and then gone on eating their hearts out and denying their sex life a normal activity. I think society is rapidly discarding that cruel doctrine, and I feel sure that if Jesus were among us today he would be the first to repudiate some of the people who are teaching such things in his name. The Hubble marriage contrasts interestingly with these other 2 cases in that it has proved on test to be genuinely and voluntarily monogamous. This voluntary monogamy suits the temperament and needs of Mr. and Mrs. Hubble. It makes them happy. Anything else, if they should practice it, would make them unhappy. Their impulses and preferences, in other words, are precisely opposite to those of Phyllis and Bert. But note that it must be a voluntary and a fake monogamy. 97 Monogamy. Had Hubble, by showing jealousy, attempted to make of it anything other than a voluntary monogamy, it would have become what the marriage of Phyllis and Bert is, a fake monogamy. By the same token, if jealousy could be eliminated from the marriage of Phyllis and Bert, it might become, like the Hubble **Riage, a voluntary monogamy. I think it would probably end through a triangular phase, but I think, in the end, they would tire of it and find it inadequate, and that they would find a real monogamy better suited to their needs. Our racial experience seems to show that monogamy is better fitted to the needs of most human beings than any other form of relationship between the sexes. I feel sure it will predominate in marriage by virtue of its own inherent merits if given a chance. Where we make our mistake is in thinking it can be forced, and that any departure from it on the part of any number of individuals will destroy it. What destroys it is our system of forcing it on people whether they think they want it or not. 14. The evidence before me indicates that triangular relationships in marriage make some persons happy, and that such relationships, when the parties mutually consent to them, have put many a **riage on a psychologically stable basis. Such persons would often be unhappy if divorce should separate them. They insist that they love and need each other, in spite of their outside fancies. These, permit me to emphasize, are facts. I ask the indignant reader, if he is indignant, not to hold me responsible for them. I record them for his information. Our social traditions have taught all of us since childhood that the triangle is intrinsically and unscapably tragic, that it must from its very nature deprive one of its members of his or her rights, and that an absolute monogamy in marriage is, without exception, the only basis on which marriage can be made to work. When a marriage fails, we never say of it that it failed because it was monogamous, though we wouldn't hesitate to say of a marriage that it failed because it was polygamous. This may be orthodox, but it is not necessarily reasonable. If an unconventional polygamy 98 can ruin this marriage, why should not a forced monogamy rule that? Many men may have many minds about most things, but they are not permitted to have them about this one, on which they differ more, perhaps, in taste and natural bent, than about any other thing. Here they must be uniform. Here one man's meat cannot be admitted to be another man's poison, even if it is. There may be diversity of taste, but there must be outward uniformity of response. Differing conditions, differing capacity, differing needs, all met by the same prescription. And this in the most variable and intimate of human relationships. In no other phase of life do we expect this absurd and impossible thing of human beings. This is in no sense an attack on monogamous marriage. I have said before, and I say it again, that I think the marriage in which one man and one woman fill each other's lives is the ideal marriage. That is the thing to strive for and hope for. But when individuals find themselves so constituted or so matched that they desire in their hearts some variation from this ideal, then I am sure that the restrictions they impose on each other tend to make a tragedy out of conduct which would otherwise be innocuous and often only temporary. The subjective effect on the individual of conduct carried out in secret violation of such restrictions is often devastating to health, morals, and common decency, and the social consequences, if there be no secrecy, are just as bad or worse. Thus the effort to achieve an outward respectability often makes persons who rebel against our social code genuinely immoral, while a courageous sincerity and openness in unconventional conduct makes others seem immoral in the eyes of society, and so destroys them by an adverse and hateful social suggestion, which they are constrained subjectively to accept. Non-monogamic marriages would, I think, usually become monogamous if allowed to work themselves out freely. If they didn't, they would be falling short of the ideal, of course, but they would still usually work out with a reasonable degree of happiness for all concerned. At present they work out in misery, vulgar intrigue, lies, heartburnings, hatred, cruelty, daily unkindness, neglect, sexual indifference, divorce and parentless children. This hap monogamy the fruit of culture 9*, pens in the best regulated families. Having reached the limit of endurance, the bewildered couple finally seek the divorce court, split up their homes on highly triangular charges, wrangle over the possession of their children and finally leave it to the court to determine that Johnny, aged 6 and Sadie, aged 5, are to be with their mother so much of the time and with their father so much of the time, and that they are to have a home, with 2 parents in it, none of the time. I think that if individual preferences and tastes could be given even a reasonable right of way in marriage, society would benefit incalculably by such a change. I think society suffers untellable and unguessable harm from the traditions of marriage which are in the saddle at present, however fundamentally desirable may be the monogamic ideal back of those traditions. I am anxious, in this connection, not to give the impression that I favor the triangle in marriage. I don't favor it. I think it far better when couples are so matched that they genuinely don't want any outside episodes. I think monogamy is natural and that marriage in general tends to seek the monogamic status. I think such a status is attainable on a free will basis in most marriages, and that it would, under favorable conditions of freedom in marriage, tend to become more so. But the monogamic preference, when genuinely felt, under the artificial conditions of a civilization that has gotten very far away from nature and from the jungle, is a product of culture. It involves voluntary self-restraint and voluntary self-discipline. It must be evolved by society on a free will basis, and it can't be legislated or otherwise forced into existence. At present we are legislating and forcing, and the more legislating and forcing we do, the more unmistakable becomes the rebellion on the part of men and women everywhere. And in such rebellion there is great peril for the individuals involved in it. I feel no alarm about these social tendencies, but I am often keenly alarmed for the welfare of individuals who get themselves so entangled in the machinery of change that they are in danger of being crushed in the wheels. When I deal with individuals, I there 104 urge them to abstain, if possible, from monkeying with the buzzsaw, to keep away from it and to leave that diversion to persons whose special talents seem to make it, if not safe, at least less dangerous. But if they insist on their own way, why, then I do what I can for them and let it go at that. There is no use in trying forcibly to stop either them or the machine. Why waste one's energy trying or one's breath denouncing? Why not give help, guidance, and tolerant sympathy instead? This can be done. And the doing of it would be easy if society would look to the beam that is in its own eye and pluck from its heart that darkest of superstitions, the ultimate blasphemy, that God is static and Satan progressive.